Welcome back. This is Jen the Liberty Lion, and I'm going to go over video 2 here. And we're talking about Mr. Davis in 1841, his speech in Congress on the Public Lands Act and what it meant to him, and where the money was going, and how he thought the distribution of the money for the sale of the public lands was unfair to the people at large, or what he calls the inhabitants, rather than them. It's going to the state or the wealthy people, and he won't vote for the bill to pass because he doesn't agree with how the federal government is distributing the money from the sale of the public lands. There's a lot of stuff he talks about in here that I really hope that you stay tuned and listen to, because it's very important. And he beautifully explains and passionately explains to Congress in 1841 some of the things that I have been talking about in my videos. So this is the second Davis video. Okay, so this video is part 2 of the speech of Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis talks of the 2 or 3 objections he has to the bill for the sale of the public lands. You want to hear this speech by Mr. Davis. It's very telling that in 1841, he saw what was coming. It's been slow and methodical. He describes this in his speech here, and the last part of the transition from a bottom-up power system to a top-down power system is in play. And he describes this. He says that he says all these things in the speech, and he's warning of this takeover back in 1841. If you watched the first video, you heard me talk about the Bourbons, which he mentioned in his video. And it's sort of like he's saying that the people who become powerful have a love of power, and they want to revert back to the European system where it's a top-down power system. Okay, so listen up, because the first few videos might be a little boring, but we get to the juice very soon. So he starts this section of the speech by saying that there are public lands within the state that are sold, that the money goes to the federal treasury, and from there, the states are given a portion. Davis states that this is wrong, that the states should sell the lands and give the portion to the federal government. But the rest of the money should go to the people of the states. He goes on and says that some states, 9 in number, were given more money for their lands, and he believes that this is to get their support to pass a yay on the bill for the sale of the public lands. So he's sort of saying it's a bribe to get the states to pass it. That even if members were in favor of the bill, they would still vote against it simply for the fact that this part of the bill is wrong, which is the federal government giving the money to the states rather than to the people where it really belongs. So Davis says the bill benefits the rich rather than the poor, that it would spark a rich versus poor issue. But Davis says he'll go even further. So he says, quote, a new and unconstitutional principle into the powers of distribution, unjust and unequal in every respect. This bill proposes to distribute the proceeds of the lands among the states on the federative principle and not on the popular principle. It gives the money to the states and not the people. To whom are these lands sold? He's asking Congress. To the people and not to the states, and to the states contribute nothing to the recipients. So on my note, I admire him for what he says in this speech. He stands up against the rich and the states and describes the acts of the federal government that increases the wealth of the state rather than the people, and to whom the real wealth belongs, since we intend to be a bottom-up system of government. The wealth and power belongs to the people, not to the governments or the wealthy. Mr. Davis is stating that it is an usurpation of power to give the money of the sale of the public lands to the states, and it's wrong to use the Constitution to do this because it's not what the founders intended. He goes on to say, and of course you can read this on your own and provide a link. If this government can take money from the people by revenue or any other processes, tip of the hand, in order to distribute it again with the other, both operations ought to be conducted on the same principle and by the same rule. The federative principle is a particularly of our government. It has respect to the people in their aggregate capacity as states and not to their individual capacity as men. So let's see, where am I? Because I got to turn the page here in a minute. So now he starts to talk about the issue of taxation. The apportionment of the sale of public lands, that the federal government was to tax the states, the capitation tax. And the capitation tax was upon the states. Then the amount allotted to the states is collected from the inhabitants or their property or direct tax by the federal government. Here, I still believe that Mr. Davis has some incorrect information or ideas of the Constitution and what the public lands were or where they were. But I'm not going to get into that can of worms. It'll be a long conversation. But again, we have the issue of the Constitution with the word state. Which state? The dependent state, meaning the federal lands, or the independent state, meaning the states that created the federal government. That's the can of worms. But for now, we just look at the issue from Davis's perspective. So Davis says Congress cannot lay a capitation tax of the same amount upon each person of the Union or a direct tax of the same amount on specific articles or a specified quantity of property throughout the states. It must be apportioned to the states on the federate principle, and then that apportionment is to be separately reapportioned and collected from the persons or property in each particular state. Again, my view of state in the Constitution are the federal areas within a specified territory, or that is the federal dependent state, which Davis later mentions, but very briefly. So, sale of public lands would be the sale of the federal lands, in my opinion, back to the states, and the money from the sale should be divided between the independent states, as those are public lands under federal control, and they should have been sold back to the independent states long ago. So the building of forts was a joint project between all the states, and after all the states have a fort, the lands possibly would have been sold back to, or at least the excess of lands would have been sold back to the independent states, and the proceeds equally shared among the states. However, with state not being defined as either the dependent state or independent state in the Constitution, it's hard to know or impossible to know exactly what was intended. I personally stick to the principle of a very small federal government, and I believe that's what the founders actually intended. And so when speaking on the sale of public lands, I go along with the perception that they mean the federal lands, that is the federal dependent states. Whatever was in excess or after the forts were built, it would be sold back to the state. And that would be the federal sale of the public lands back to the state. So Davis then goes on to talk about tariffs. I believe that's here somewhere. So Davis says, but we shall soon see that this bill collects by one rule and pays out by another. So the federal government's a hypocrite, he's saying, because it's taking using one principle and then giving back using a completely different principle. So it takes from one portion of the people and distributes it to another. Or, in other words, exacts from the many and distributes to the few. So it's to give to the wealthy, or to take from the people and give to the state. So it's a federal government that takes from the people and gives to the state. And he goes on, a vast revolution of sentiment is taking place with the people at large, and even manufacturers themselves begin to doubt whether that is the true system for their own real prosperity and success, because they're not benefiting. So if the poor and the inhabitants and the many are not benefiting from the system, how could it have been a system that was to benefit the poor? Because it's not doing what it was intended. And they're starting to recognize that through the process of experience. They're understanding that this is not going right. Something's wrong. Davis starts talking about imported goods, etc. He has a thought process which I'll briefly describe. So he says first that the tax, he's talking about the taxes. The tax do not raise prices. Importer absorbs the cost. It discourages excessive imports, encourages domestic manufacturing, and then import increases domestic prosperity. That's one school of thought. The second school of thought was the tariff is a tax in disguise. Duty is upon any article by law. The tax equals raises price of article. So to tax something increases the price of the article. Without the increase in price, no revenue is derived, and consumer pays the increased price. Cheap foreign goods makes it difficult for domestic manufacturers to compete and decreases domestic prosperity. So in other words, the tax does no good for the people in America. And then later my notes on what he's saying is that consumers, who are the people at large may be any group of people, all the people of a country, all the people of the government, all the people of the military, all the people of a state, all the consumers of imports controlled by the federal government, etc. So we have to be really careful about when they use these vague terms. People at large can be any group of people. So what group of people exactly is it? Just like state. What state are you talking about? The federal state are the dependent states, which are the federal areas inside the independent states. They're not the same. The Constitution doesn't say the dependent states here do this and that, and the independent states here, they do this and that, and the independent states won't do this, the dependent states won't do that. So what is it that they're talking about? What state? So the consumers are the people at large is not an exact or concrete statement. Consumers of what? At large of what group? Okay, so I'll also upload this document with my notes on it, and then you can read what I'm talking about along with what you're seeing, and I'll probably upload it to archive.org. High tariff or protective systems, he mentions. And he says, I consider the whole of what has been termed the American system is founded in error and resting on falsehood and delusion. Okay, so this is what I'm getting at here in my videos. And he says it really well. He says it's resting on falsehood and delusion. And this is delusion is the idea of flipping power on its head. The power in America was supposed to be from the bottom up, and they're flipping it. And they're trying to make it top down, and it's been a slow, methodical process, which he mentions later. Okay, so let's see, let's undo that. I have a few more things to say in this video, and then we're done with video 2. If it shall be said that under that system of high tax, the country has grown and prospered. So he's against the high tax. He says that his answer to this is that this country has not grown up, that it's grown in defiance of that system. So even with the high tax system that has kept it in his belief from growing, it has still grown, but it would have grown probably much more without the high tax. So it's grown in defiance of it, and not from fostering energy, because a tax doesn't foster energy, it hinders it. So grown by the labor, intelligence, enterprise, and freedom of the people, and not from a tariff, tax, or any other artificial stimulant or exhausting incitement. So he's saying that the taxes are slowing the economy and slowing the growth. So there is sort of this idea that if taxation was repealed or ended, that there would be another boom in the economy. So another objection to the bill by Mr. Davis, as a side note, he refers to the phrase the property as being the state or the wealthy people, and the landed and laboring classes as the inhabitants and settlers of the states, or the people at large. I believe that's the way he's saying it. So under the operation of the law, which is now proposed to enact, the money which is to be distributed will not go to the people, but to the states, and the necessary effect must be to relieve and aid the property, rather than the people of the country, to give a decidedly and marked preference to the moneyed interest over the landed and laboring classes of the community. So that's the effect of all this taxes and tariffs and all these things, and the sale of the public lands and the money going to the states rather than to the people, is that it's going to the moneyed or the wealthy or the state rather than the people who are actually laboring to do the work. Okay, so like, share, subscribe. This is, again, video 2 of the Davis speech, and we'll be starting video 3